President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. I was on Stemmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the President as he made his way toward the trademark. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Stemmons Freeway.
On November the 22nd, 1963, at 12:30, the whole system of the American form of government collapsed when John Kennedy was assassinated.
The Soviet news agency TASS carried a flash on its circuit this afternoon saying it has been officially announced that the United States President John F. Kennedy has died in a hospital after an attempt was made on his life by persons, as believed, from among the extreme right-wing elements.
Look at who benefited by his death, and then one can reach a reasonable conclusion as to who might have been part of his assassination.
Air action is now in execution against gunboats and supporting facilities in and near 4 ports in North Vietnam.
The war in Vietnam continued on for another 11 years.
So say 10:30 our time, the North Vietnamese would be aware of attacking aircraft coming in.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it.
I'm Paul Wright to continue our investigation into the tragic and fascinating story of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. In our last programme we heard celebrated JFK assassination expert Vincent Lavery explain how serious inconsistencies and question marks exist in the official 1964 Warren Report into JFK's death, as to whether Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK alone or if at all. Now we've reached the point in the story where Vincent Lavery is recounting the life story of Lee Harvey Oswald and how Oswald went to live in the USSR for 2 years in the late 1950s during the height of the anti-communist era in the United States. So what occurred next? Over to Vincent Lavery.
And while at his return from the Soviet Union, he separates from his wife. By this time he has 2 children, and he separates from his wife. He rents a 1-bedroom in a private home, and he doesn't have a driving license. So on Fridays, he gets a ride back to his lodgings by a fellow called Buell Frazier. But on Thursday, he asks Buell Frazier to take him home to where his wife and children live. And Buell Frazier says, "Oh, why, it's Thursday, you normally go back on Friday." And he says, "Well, I want to go back to get some curtain rods for my new 1-room apartment." The government states, of course, that he went back on that Thursday to pick up the weapon to kill the president on Friday. Buell Frazier drops him off at the wife and 2 children at their home, and that night, over the course of several hours, his wife asks him the following questions and has, paraphrasing the following conversation, "What do you think of John Kennedy?" He said, well, I like the Kennedy family, but I don't particularly like John Kennedy. Now, one must remember when one hears the government's report on this, that he has gone back home to get the weapon because he's already made up his mind he's going to kill the President of the United States. Later on, she says, oh, the President, John Kennedy, is going to go by the Tech School Book Depository building. And he says, oh, I'm not interested. The next morning, he leaves whatever money he has on him, which is about $14, and his wedding band on the side table. And he walks across the street to Buell Frazier, who is going to take him back to work on that Friday morning, and is carrying a package. Your listeners will have to do a bit of theatre of the mind here. The package is rectangular, and the Warren Commission asks Frazier, how did he carry the package? First of all, Mrs. Frazier is looking out the window and sees him walking towards her son's car. And she's asked, first of all, how is he carrying the package? And she said, well, he's carrying it between his thumb and forefingers, lengthwise towards the ground. And he is swinging his arms. Buell Frazier is asked, how did he carry the package when he got to the Tech School Book Depository building? And he says, the same way, except when he got to the stairs, he tucked it out under his arm. Well, now, the interesting thing about this particular part of the story is that the weapon broken down could not be carried under those circumstances. It would have been dragging along the ground because of its length. The curtain rods in question, which were found on the 6th floor of the Tech School Book Depository building, were 22 inches, and you could swing your arm as you walked, holding the rectangular package between your thumb and forefingers. The government of the United States says, of course, that Buell Frazier is mistaken, that he must have had his wrist elevated in order not to hit the ground, and that his mother, Mrs. Frazier, is also mistaken. The point, of course, hopefully I've got across, is if you can show a fourth bullet, then Lee Harvey Oswald did not do it alone, because there is no scientific, under the laws of science, physics, could he have got off 4 bullets because of the time. So if a fourth bullet can be shown, or to be fired, or if a bullet from a different direction was shown, then Lee Harvey Oswald did not obviously do it alone, or may have had nothing directly to do with the assassination of President Kennedy, because the government's case is only 3 bullets could have been fired, and as I've said several times, 1 man, 1 gun, 3 bullets. If you can show a fourth bullet, it means there was a second man, and if there was a second man, then it's open season as to what are the facts of the assassination of President John Kennedy.
Are you and the rest of the police convinced you are the right man now? I think we do. Are there any other suspects linked with Oswald? No.
What I didn't point out on the government's case, although it's built into what I said, the government created a situation whereby they were asking for trouble. Had they given some kind of maybe, but they couldn't do that, because if they said maybe, then the American public would have said keep investigating until you end the maybe. And so the government believed it could get away. I don't know if it believed it could get away with it forever, but it was a way of silencing the people in 1963. You must remember the decade of the 60s in America was the most violent decade in the history of the country, outside of the Civil War. And to have the American public believe that there was a conspiracy to kill a president of the United States, rather than just lay it simply on the shoulders of a 24-year-old, functionally semi-articulate high school dropout from New Orleans, Louisiana, the American public could not have taken.
Madness and hate erupt anew in Dallas as President Kennedy's accused assassin is shot down himself during a jail transfer. There's an ominous symbol in Lee Harvey Oswald's murder weapon as he is taken to the city jail basement where an armored car is to move him to a maximum security cell. Oswald walks his last mile. His assailant moves in from the right.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Now, from another camera, the motion is slowed. The murderer moves in, and here is the shame of all America as Jack Rubenstein takes the law unto himself. The dying Oswald is rushed to the same hospital where President Kennedy died. Doctors work to save his life. But 48 hours and 7 minutes after the president's death, his accused slayer is dead.
We were talking earlier about people on the periphery who died, and there is an interesting bit of the story that fits in, which isn't found. This is the first thing where I'm diverting from the Warren Report Commission. For many years, probably starting in the early 70s, there was a school of thought which pursued people on the periphery of the Kennedy assassination who died mysteriously. One person was hung, one person committed suicide, a couple were murdered, a couple were lost, a couple were poisoned, a couple fell out windows, and the suggestion was that there was still some force out there killing people so that they wouldn't divulge information. I never placed any real merit on that until 1988, when there's a man involved in this whole thing called George de Morenchild, who was originally from Holland and was living in Dallas, and he was in the flower business, which is rather appropriate for somebody from Holland, and he was a millionaire, but he was also, in the 60s, he knew Lee Harvey Oswald, and Lee Harvey Oswald and many of the Russian community in Dallas associated with this family, the Morenchild. But I think it was 1988 or maybe 1987, George de Morenchild on a Friday said he was going to hold a press conference on the Monday and give information about Lee Harvey Oswald and the Kennedy assassination. So I waited with bated breath to hear what George de Morenchild was going to say. And I think it was Saturday night he committed suicide. And so I tell that part of this whole adventure, for the want of a better word, simply because it does kind of connect all of the dots. Lloyd's of London pointed out that the odds of these people dying the way they did, based on their age and their background and their health conditions and their job, Lloyd's could kind of pinpoint at what age we're all going to die for the sake of life insurance policies. Said the odds of these people dying were similar to shuffling a pack of cards and dealing them in correct suit order, which is slightly
1,000,000 to 1, basically.
I'm sure I think it's even more than 1 million. If I'm not, I've heard the figure, but it's well over 1 million. Well over 1 million. So when George de Morenchild died, I did start sharing that part of the whole story with people. And
we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists. Well,
I have in my hand here a story from Reuters in Washington, D.C., dated May the 17th, 2007. And the article says, I'll read, bullet analysis used to justify the lone assassin theory behind President John F. Kennedy's assassination is based on flawed evidence, according to a team of researchers, including a former top FBI scientist. Writing in the Annals of Applied Statistics, which is a very reputable scientific magazine in the United States of America, the researchers urged a re-examination of bullet fragments from the 1963 shooting in Dallas to confirm the number of bullets that struck Kennedy. Official investigations during the 60s, as we've already talked about, concluded that Kennedy was hit by 2 bullets fired by Lee Harvey Oswald. But the researchers, including former FBI lab metallurgist William Tobin, said new chemical and statistical analysis of bullets from the same batch used by Oswald suggests that more than 2 bullets could have struck the president. Evidence used to rule out a second assassin is fundamentally flawed, the researchers said in their article. If the assassination bullet fragments are derived from 3 or more separate bullets, then second assassin is likely. Well, I wouldn't even include the word likely. I'd say is absolute, simply because the government's case is, for the 99th time, I've said it, is based on 7.8 seconds, 3 shots could only have been fired, 2 bullets hit their target, 1 man, 1 gun, 3 bullets. If you can show a 4th bullet, either Lee Harvey Oswald did not do it or did not do it alone. But if there's a 4th bullet or a 5th bullet, obviously, then there is more than one person. If there's more than one person, then by any definition there was a conspiracy to kill the President of the United States on November the 22nd, 1963.
And who were the conspirators?
Then it's open season. Until it is established clearly that there was a 4th bullet, and that has never been established clearly yet. It's only, as I'm trying to do, through logic and reason, one will say there's a 4th bullet. If there is a 4th bullet or more, then one can connect who benefited by his death.
And who did benefit by his death? I mean, who are the different categories or groups that most probably benefited by his death, Vincent?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer at this juncture, because once again I haven't given all the information. But let me try it this way. Kennedy, at that time, Robert Kennedy was getting ready to do a massive investigation of the FBI and the CIA. If anyone had suggested in 1963 that the FBI was wiretapping people like Martin Luther King, for example, if anyone had suggested in 1963 that the CIA was assassinating world leaders, if anyone had suggested in 1963 that the Teamster Union was working in conjunction with the Mafia in Las Vegas, if anyone had suggested in 1963 that the government of the United States was working with the Mafia to overthrow and to kill Castro, and several more things, they would have been looked upon as nutcases.
They would have been proverbially shot down anyway, that's for certain.
They would have been. However, we now know that Kennedy, specifically Robert Kennedy, was getting ready to do a massive investigation of the FBI, was getting ready to do a massive investigation of the CIA, was getting ready to do a massive investigation of the Teamster Pension Fund, was getting ready to do a massive investigation of the Mafia controls in Las Vegas, was getting ready to end the war in Vietnam after he won the election in '64, was getting ready to do much greater work in the area of civil rights, was getting ready to clean up Texas and Illinois politics. So all of these things never took place. It took maybe a quarter of a century later for these things to come to the front. The church hearings now show that the FBI, the CIA, the Mafia, the Cuban connections, the pro-Cuban, all of these were active secretly. And so they all benefited by his death. With John Kennedy's death, none of these
investigations
took place. The war in Vietnam continued on for another 11 years.
Air action is now in execution against gunboats and supporting facilities in and near 4 ports of North Vietnam. Say 10:30 our time, the North Vietnamese would be aware of attacking aircraft coming in.
But we don't plan to surrender either, and we don't plan to pull out either, and we don't plan to let people influence us and pressure and force us to divide our nation in a time of national peril. The hour is here.
The most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
One must remember, and this is probably the key to it, one has to have the facts before one reaches any conclusion. But I think it is reasonable to say that there was no group of people who met at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, let's kill the President of the United States. That did not happen. It's by its osmosis, a look and a wink. There's a need. Take care. I'll reward you. This is the most likely scenario as how Kennedy got assassinated. It's called a look and a wink. You do this and talk to somebody, and in turn I'll give you a new airport for your town. I'll give you a new driveway at your house. So the Kennedy assassination is not a group of conspirators who sat down at a table and said, let's do it. It was like a stone thrown across a lake. It bounced from here to here to here to here, and before you knew it, the first maker did not know exactly who was going to do it. So in the Kennedy assassination, there is no, once again, I'm repeating myself, there's no conspirators who sat down and said, who's going to pull the trigger, who's going to do this. But then if you get into Lee Harvey Oswald's life, and that's why it's extremely difficult to come to conclusions, because one has to look at Lee Harvey Oswald's last words. His last words were, I'm a patsy. Translated into English is, I'm a ringer. Translated into English is, I'm a set-up. They were his last words before he was killed. So after 2 days in jail and being charged with the killing of Officer Tippit and John Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald puts in a whole lot of stuff which we haven't got into perspective, and he says, I was set up. That's his last line.
President, the only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam, and we've got our difficulties there, quite obviously.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
Look at who benefited by his death, and then one can reach a reasonable conclusion as to who might have been part of his assassination. There's so many areas that were affected positively by their death. Investigations never took place, wars continued, civil rights movement allegedly were halted to some degree, relations with Russia and Cuba were affected. The role of the Mafia in America was affected. The Teamster, I've articulated them all. All of these benefited, for the want of a better word, by his death. Now the question that needs to be asked, or people need to think about, correction, not the question that needs to be asked, they need to think about is do research on this issue and then form your own opinion as to who possibly put this whole act together. When you talk about the Kennedy assassination, you're talking about macro politics. You're talking about a level of politics that most people don't even entertain in their political thoughts, because you're talking about the most powerful people, some of them unseen, some of them we wouldn't know their names, who one could make, once again, a reasonable, logical statement that they were involved in the death of Kennedy.
And we've come to the end of our investigation into the tortured story of the tragic assassination of JFK in 1963. Profuse thanks to interviewee Vincent Lavery for his expert commentary over the last 3 programmes. And until we meet again in some other hidden avenue of history, well, I'm going to leave the last word with a slain Commander-in-Chief.
I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task.
I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
I pledge you that we shall neither commit nor provoke aggression, that we shall neither flee nor invoke the threat of force.
We shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. and we are all mortal.